My name is Jeremy Chow. I am an assistant professor of English at Bucknell University, and my pronouns are he, him, his. My talk today is entitled Extinction's Such a Drag. In episode 4 of RuPaul's Drag Race Season 12, which aired in March 2020, the Queen's mini challenge is the bee's knees. Ru informs the 10 remaining contestants, ladies, America's next drag superstar needs to act globally and think locally. The mini challenge, Ru continues, is to raise awareness of the world's declining bee population. The queens respond with a collective, sobering awe. The task, entitled the Bee Hive Jive, challenges the group to get into Bee Beautiful Quick Drag, equipped with black and yellow wings and hip pads, and perform a buzz-worthy dance to gain an advantage in the main challenge. When the 10 have assumed the beehive formation, Ru serves up more melitological knowledge. Now, bees are a crucial part of our ecosystem, pollinating fruits, vegetables, and the grains we eat. So without bees, we are fucked. And without D's, Ru trails off with a characteristic rhyming euphemism. The livelihood of bee colonies and gay sex are analogized as equal tenets of queer survival. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee fills the sound waves, and the contestants swarm around Ru in chaotic fashion while she attempts to swat them away. Has anyone seen my EpiPen? Ru cries. Alternating between Flight of the Bumblebee and Ru's own musical stylings, the queens demonstrate their breakout dancing chops in hopes of garnering the mini challenge win. The puns explode. She better run a honeycomb through that wig. She is giving me Beyonce. Now she's giving me B. Arthur. Be careful with that stinger. Now just the tip. Gigi Good, the mini challenge winner and season runner-up, exclaims, I guess this means I'm the queen to beat this season. In addition to the $2,500 cash tip awarded to Gigi, a $2,500 donation is bestowed upon the Honeybee Conservancy, a public charity that installs apiaries across the US and Canada. Closing the segment, Ru breaks the fourth wall. At the honeybeeconservancy.org, you'll find simple things you can do to save the bees. Gigi clutches her heart and the other queens applaud. I open with the Beehive Jive to suggest that it operates as a simulacrum of Drag Race's recurrent covert attention to environmental disasters. Drag Race's commitment to reiterating the planetary woes of climate change, rising sea levels, and the politics of extinction unwittingly overlays environmental advocacy with the show's queer acceptability politics. Ecological and queer well-being and resilience thus operate as two sides of the same coin, and such an acknowledgement highlights the queer ecological perspectives I undertake. My talk considers drag and Drag Race in particular to examine how the show's apocalyptic aesthetics tarry with the proximity and imminence of an environmentally destroyed present and future, all the while demonstrating that drag and its gender-bending performativity is what endures. In other words, in the face of apocalypse, drag's resilience avails opportunities to imagine queer survival. On the high heels of this apocalyptic aesthetic visualized by the series, drag queens become queer embodiments that persist and adapt to an eschatology realized. The gender bending of drag, Meredith Heller observes, encompasses a generative and rich potential in that it can build community, create safer spaces, and over time, lead to more possibilities for queer lives. The apocalyptic futures imagined by Drag Race position new communities, new safer spaces, perhaps ironically so, and new queer lives to which drag attests. While this may feel like a rose-colored queer optimism, perhaps a cruel optimism, in this collection of episodes and challenges, we behold drag as a means to adapt to planetary destruction and recuperate an environmentally toxified future. For example, during the Alaskan Winter Realness runway of the Last Ball on Earth challenge aired on season 10, the queens sport stunning swimsuits as a means of adapting to Alaska's climate change geography. One of the season frontrunners, Asia O'Hara, narrates alongside her own look, yes, it is the end of the world, but a bitch is still gonna look good. In the face of adversity, O'Hara and her fellow competitors recuperate both the misogynistic, animalizing epithet bitch and end times as opportunities to look good and thus signal queer survival despite a crumbling world that assuredly does not look good. The queens thus advertise and perform extinction as a particular drag aesthetic and a meta-realization of the word challenge, first in its sense as a competition, and second as a larger planetary obstacle for which there is, at first glance, no remediation. As with Beehive Jive, the recurrence of environmentally oriented challenges positions Drag Race within an apocalyptic environmental futurism, which reasons that drag is both a premonition of this futurism and its outcomes. But these modes of queer environmental thinking cannot be extricated from the series' intersectional racial and gender representations. Drag Race, as you might know, habitually represents one of the most racially and ethnically diverse casts on television, and so these representations, alongside the espoused environmental concerns, necessitate a queer of color critique. The threat of extinction for queer communities is not exclusively a concern of the present. The threat of queer, Black, Latinx, and trans extinction is a quotidian process that the show invariably positions as running parallel to environmental extinction. In this way, drag queens, especially drag queens of color, as leaders within queer communities, let's remind ourselves of the fact that drag queens were those who refused to acquiesce police brutality any longer and inaugurated gay liberation at Stonewall, recognize these conjoined threats through Drag Race's environmental bent. In Neil Ahuja's words, perhaps queer theory has always been a theory of extinction. So too, I show, is this the case for drag's queer apocalypse, a sartorial aesthetic and an embodied reality, but one in which extinction is an ongoing event for queer and racial communities. In other words, Drag Race's eco-challenges beg the question, what survives when the apocalypse arrives? Drag. Or as Rue orates in Rupocalypse Now, you are the hope for future generations of glamazons everywhere. The episode in which I'll primarily focus is the season 4 premiere entitled Rupocalypse Now. As the first episode of the season, Drag Race semantically envisions season 4 as Apocalypse Now. The start of season 4 is then the instauration of a new epic, a new season, and a new way of environmental being populated by drag queens. Only 3 things will survive the Rupocalypse, Rue informs the queens: cockroaches, Cher, and drag queen zombies. Streaks of fear paint the queens' faces. Gentlemen, Rue resumes with one of her distinctive sound bites contorted to fit the challenge. Start your engines, and may the best woman live. Live here replaces her usual win. They are undoubtedly linked here, and thus prime our understanding of queer livelihood and success as integral to apocalyptic survivalism. The challenge, Rue reports, will be a living nightmare. Rue instructs the contestants to, quote, scavenge among the ruins to create a fabulous outfit that screams post-apocalyptic couture. Provided with minimal supplies, the queens must loot yards of fabric and accessories from drag queen zombies. The human race depends on you for the survival of drag, Rue states, but if you fail, it's not the end of the world. Oh wait, it is, so don't fuck it up. The new queens race about snatching available materials from zombie alumna. Rue's post-apocalypse then realizes drag queens as dystopian peoples who embodied both the zombie victims, that is, former Drag Race contestants, and with the new cast, the survivalists. By bringing these queens back and zombifying them, Rue implicitly signals the resilience of these drag characters and the recyclability of drag as a sustainable Ouroboros. Drag queens are the apocalyptic everyman. The Drag Zombie Apocalypse Maxi Challenge may position drag within the throes of disaster, yet this is a disaster in which the contestants are explicitly tasked with saving drag and with it, humanity. As Rue's embodiment of disaster in the mini challenge suggests, the disaster that drag might truck is a recuperation that rejects the homophobic logic of queer being as disastrous, monstrous, or unnatural. Set against the background of a seedy, abandoned motel in downtown Los Angeles, the former drag queen zombies represent drag as an aesthetic of eviction and putrefaction from which morphs other forms of queer vitality. The queens then stylize monster drag, a subgenre that has existed only on the fringes of queer culture, but has recently ascended to cult popularity through the Boulet brothers' Dragula, which, following Drag Race's suit, seeks to crown the world's next drag super monster. The undead drag body then refines forms of queer temporality to forge a queer inhumanism who, in Drag Race, wander the earth with trinkets and vestiges from which to construct fashion couture. Queer inhumanisms, Dana Luciano and Mel Chen contend, play not only with these same temporal spheres, but also what they identify as a concerted effort to imagine anthrodecentrism, which, like Catherine Yusoff and N.K. Jemisin, critique philosophies of the human and at the same time imagine how queer, critical race, intersectional feminist, and disability studies can attend to the precarity of humanness and those demarcated as outside or beyond the limits of the human. Drag queen zombies articulate one mode of queer inhumanism. At the same time, the drag queen zombie as a collective form effaces individuality and rejects the anthropocentrism, of the living, yet another gesture of what Luciano and Chen term anthrodecentrism. The season 4 queens employ the Zom corpse as inspiration and invigoration by which to further queer the post-apocalyptic orientation of drag. Drag zombies thus visualize new forms of environmental being where their collective decay becomes the fecund plot for other drag iterations to blossom. In RuPapocalypse Now, these corpses are reanimated with all the fixtures of dragdom. Upon pilfering drag zombies of Zooty shards, the design challenge foisted upon the queens offers alternative rhetorical and drag aesthetic forms by which to overcome environmental disaster. The princess, for example, imagines her outfit as Waterworld couture in homage to Kevin Costner's Waterworld. Her rendering of staying afloat in water worlds, her outfit gives the impression of orange life preservers overlaid on maritime stripes, underscores rising sea levels, which are similarly documented in Costner's Waterworld, set in 2500, alongside the thick of glacial melt. By climate scientists' assessments at the current rate of climate change induced by human behavior and activity, visions of Waterworld may very well be realized in 2100 by all coastal communities and have already inundated archipelagic nations like the Marshall Islands. The princess's runway look imagines what it might mean for drag queens to stay afloat. Kenya Michaels' ensemble, on the other hand, envisions the post-apocalypse as the setting wherein drag glamour rises from the ashes. She fashions herself a phoenix. Kenya, as a trans Puerto Rican drag performer, renders the phoenix as a post-apocalyptic figuration where Latinx transgender representation and drag survive the fall of mankind. The apocalypse as eschatology enables the death of gendered normativities that drag both exaggerates and appends. The mythical phoenix that rises from the apocalypse then operates as a metonym for a queer ecology that heralds the coming of a queer acceptability of plural genders and gender performances. Ultimately, the Couture Challenge positions drag as a fundamental means to establish what Bill McKibben refers to as a relatively livable world forged from our inability to halt climate change, where queer kin and subjectivity are acquired through the embodiment of apocalypse now. Synced with Kenya's Phoenix drag, Ru asked the queens, rise from the glittery ashes to blow us all away with post-apocalyptic couture. Are you ready to see what's on the other side? On the other side of post-apocalypse lives drag as a resurrective aesthetic that adapts to planetary destruction. To conclude, I want to acknowledge that it matters little to me if the queens featured on Drag Race are not outright climate advocates, do death drops at climate strikes, or follow Greta Thunberg on social media. To criticize the show of greenwashing would be apt. However, what I've shown here is that there's a progressive queer determination to these recurrent eco-challenges, which reveals that Drag Race's social and political tension and reinforcement of what many consider to be a monolith of drag is embedded with a flavor of queer environmentalism. The series repeatedly reminds audiences that despite our past, present, and future environmental disasters, drag becomes a means by which to combat nihilism and also, as with Kenya Michaels' Phoenix, a possible ontology that displaces, suspends, and survives environmental disaster. Drag's environmental bent is both a realization of the disasters wrought by climate change and an apocalyptic aesthetic that seeks to flourish from the ruination. While planetary obstacles foretell mass extinction, drag queens are the vanguards of a possible queer future wrought from climactic uncertainty. In Ru's immortal words, which serve as didactic encouragement here, good luck and don't fuck it up.